welcome. Thank you for participating. Uh, I just want to start by just getting an idea of what your experience is within uh, the spiritual as a genre and also just Black sacred music as a whole.
Okay. I grew up, born and reared in the city of Detroit, Michigan, which is, to me, one of the great pantheons of Black and American music in general, but certainly relegates itself to Black sacred music in a very special way. Most in America and beyond would connect it primarily to Black gospel music. Of course, for the likes of, oh my goodness, Aretha Franklin and C.L. Franklin, her father, but also contemporary legends like Thomas Whitfield and the Clark sisters and the Winans. But what I have gathered is that there is such a great history of Black sacred music in general that unearthed in so many of these Black churches of several different denominations. I grew up in a CME church, now known as Christian Methodist Episcopal, but historically was Colored Methodist Episcopal. And akin to the African Methodist Episcopal musical tradition, we dealt with not only Black gospel music, but anthems, classical anthems. The choir would sing choruses from the Messiah and creation regularly in Sunday worship services. But the church, this church, Carter CME, was also the first place where I experienced a spiritual, or should I say, an arrangement of a spiritual. And it was Ain't Got Time to Die. The minister of music at Carter was the great Jimmy Johnson, Dr. James Johnson, and he was not only the choir director, but he sang the tenor solo, a beautiful, beautiful lilting tenor voice that I will never forget. And that was my first experience hearing a spiritual arrangement. Later on, uh, I would attend Renaissance High School in Detroit, Michigan, which is an academic magnet, but certainly, especially at that time, was one of the predominant choral programs in Detroit public schools and Michigan in general. The choir director there was Nina Scott, who I still consider to be a mother figure to me today. She belonged to a great pantheon of Detroit-based music educators, choral educators, that were also a part of the Brazil Denard Chorale. Brazil Denard, really the keeper of the spiritual in Detroit, Michigan, for a number of different reasons. So it was there that I started to sing spiritual arrangements. It was there that I met big brothers like Stacy Gibbs and Damon Dandridge, who at that time were just starting to compose original work, but also to arrange spirituals and other forms of Black sacred music. It was there that I was introduced to the works of Adolphus Hailstork and, oh my goodness, and Undine Smith Moore and so many others. Moses Hogan, who of course at that time was, it's very interesting. Moses Hogan passed my freshman year of high school. I remember singing a tribute concert to him with several other of the choral magnates of Detroit, which included Cass Tech High School, Detroit School of Arts. I believe King was also singing at that program. And we got the news just before we sang I Am His Child, that Moses Hogan had passed. I know that was a very roundabout way, but I'm always one about presenting several names of importance to me at that time that really helped unearth uh, the Negro spiritual in specifically in its arranged context, because the raw spiritual was something that I didn't really get to hear much of until I started to visit with my grandmother at her church. At the time, she was married to a Baptist preacher, Johnny Salisbury, at Greater Southern Missionary Baptist Church. And that's where I experienced the lining of hymns, as well as spirituals as they would have been experienced in their raw form, not in the arranged continuum as with, Brazil Denard and myself and William Dawson and so many of those that place them in this concertized context. But that is as brief as I can make it, sort of an overview of my introduction to Black sacred music in general, and certainly to the Negro spiritual.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's very informative. So, with that in mind, there are obviously a lot of definitions of what makes a spiritual historically, contemporarily. I wrote a paper last semester that was sort of a literature review or a state of research project on the spiritual as it's related to the Great Migration. And as part of that, I collected a number of definitions. But how would you personally define the African American spiritual?
I place it more so in a time context, and that means for me that the Negro spiritual in its raw and original form is connected to the period of antebellum, the period of slave enslavement of enslaved Africans. It is, a repertory of songs that were composed, I shall say, by what Dr. Eileen Southern referred to as the invisible church. Because many of the enslaved Africans were unable to meet together without some form of supervision. They would often, have secret meetings, otherwise, or secret worship services. And these uh, services were the informal incubators for the creation. And it's really a community creation, right? Because we don't know of any one particular person that composed, Balm in Gilead or, Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho. So it is a community collaboration of the invisible church of enslaved Africans to create this original Black sacred music in America. It is truly America's first original art form. Certainly, in most, if not all cases, in religious form, not always connected to biblical verses, but other means of storyline, but certainly religiously based. So that in effect is my my definition of the Negro spiritual.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Sort of along that same line there, how do you understand the spiritual as being a living tradition rather than simply a historical artifact of this period?
Absolutely. This invisible church becomes visible over time, certainly with the establishment of, well, two things here. There is the establishment of our first independent Black Christian denomination, African Methodist Episcopal, by Father Richard Allen at Mother Bethel in Philadelphia. And for a time, that was a church that certainly supported the singing of, our native, well, American Black Native music, which would have been the spiritual. However, we know that for some time, especially after the failure of Reconstruction, we have a lot of mainline uh, uh, Black Baptist and Methodist churches that are not wanting to have anything to do with the spiritual. And so the living tradition is really carried on by virtue of HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, especially Fisk, with the Jubilee Singers, which is where we, start with the arranged continuum of Negro spirituals finding their way to the concert stage. And so from there is this mixture formed of the raw spiritual that most times we will experience in the church setting, the now visible Black church setting. And then not only on concert stages, certainly in school spaces and community spaces and church spaces, we also have the arranged continuum. So the living tradition is possible because of, historically Black colleges and universities, but also Black churches that found it, as church folk would say, found it not robbery to continue this tradition, keeping them alive. Yeah.
Yeah, and sort of along that same line, we talking about these community-based definitions. Obviously, that's a large part of my recital, talking about Michigan's influence and Michigan composers' influence on the spiritual. Do you see a distinctly Michigan approach to the spiritual compared to other regions and other institutions like Fisk or Hampton or any of these HBCUs? Do you see a distinctly Michigan approach? And do you think that what you've done has contributed to this approach?
Hmm. I imagine because I sat at the piano with figures like Stacey Gibbs, um, and Damon from time to time, because they would come to Renaissance when I was a student there, and they would bring their manuscripts with them, and so I would be listening as they were sort of fleshing out ideas. Michigan, and you'll forgive me for my bias that when I speak of Michigan, I'm mainly speaking about Detroit. But Michigan, Detroit is so flush with the sounds of Motown, with the sounds of Detroit Black gospel music. Detroit to this day is still the, sort of home base for contemporary Black gospel music, but also jazz. The amount of amazing jazz musicians that spent a great deal of time here, either born and reared like the great maestro Ron Carter, Yusuf Lateef, but also people like, Bird and Miles Davis who lived here, fighting his drug habit. Oh my gosh, he spent several years here right before he left to do Kind of Blue. I say that to say that all of that music fleshes itself into, I know my spiritual arrangements, but also those of, Stacy and Damon. Um, Brazil was definitely a keeper of more of the traditional form, um, as close as it could be to what we understand of the raw element of the spiritual. In that way, I feel that he was closely resembling of Burley. Burley's solo, you know, uh, renderings are very traditional in that way. Stacy and Damon and I are a bit of troublemakers, and because and Stacy and Damon from both born in the '70s and I in the '80s. were uh, listening to all of these different sounds of Detroit. And so, if there is indeed a Michigan or Detroit based approach to the spiritual, it is flush with jazz, it is flush with gospel, it is flush with uh, Motown harmonies and rhythms. We are certainly not um, afraid of utilizing those sounds, those contemporary sounds. But I also know that there are the sounds of Brazil still very seeped in us. There are definitely moments where all three of us come back to, the four-voiced standard approach to spiritual sound. Not only just by virtue of Brazil's writing, but by virtue of the sounds of the Brazil Denard chorale, which all of us were very aware of during our time growing up. I mean, I knew of the Brazil Denard chorale even before I got to high school because of my father, Alvin Waddles, who was a celebrated musician in the city of Detroit and elsewhere. I was very aware of that sound. It was such a rich, beautiful, oh my gosh, beautiful sound. Almost, to me as a child, it was a bit spooky. It was just warm and rich in that way. Um, so yeah, I think that we are able to find a very balanced approach of the contemporary with the traditional. If I was to say that there would be a very stark set for what the Michigan or Detroit based approach would be to spirituals. Yeah.
So, in that same regard, then, do you see yourself as continuing Brazil's established tradition? Do you see yourself redefining that tradition, or is it sort of a mix of both?
Definitely a mixture of both. I am hugely indebted to Brazil, to Dr. Denard, uh, if not so much in his writing, certainly in his approach to interpretation. And that is really delving more into my work as a choral conductor, an interpreter of these Negro spirituals of this continuum. In terms of my writing, I like I said, I certainly have an indebted attitude to the traditional form. And so I always try and make sure that at least some section of my arrangement really gets back to the heart of it. And that's not just with Brazil, sorry to step away from Detroit, but Wendell Whalum, who is the mentor of my mentors, David Morrow and Uzi Brown and my dearly departed Dr. James Abington, who was in Detroit for many years at Hartford Memorial Baptist Church, another great incubator for, the anthem and the spiritual and the gospel in terms of worship service. But I loved the way that Whalum was able to utilize four voices and still get such rich harmony and color out of his arrangements. And so I try to find the balance between Brazil and Whalum and the new, because not only am I bringing Motown and jazz and gospel, but also sometimes music theater um, sort of tropes find their way into my arrangements as well. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. Speaking on that interpretive element, especially as a choral conductor, what responsibilities do composers, arrangers, and conductors have when presenting spirituals today?
Oh my gosh, the melody is key. The melody is key. It, in my estimation, should not be altered with, if at all possible. You should find your way to ensure that that melody, that initial melody, because that's what they had. They didn't have a number of instruments to create different harmonies, you know, to the melody. So the melody is what they had. The words are what they had. Those words are so important. I think that often we get bogged down with, you know, dialectic pronunciation and all of those things. And I try and offer to people that our ancestors were, as Mariah Carey would say, I'm doing the best with what I got. So they were coming with so many different um, dialectic backgrounds, and they were making use of the English language by virtue of their own foundation. And that's the way that many of the original arrangers like John Work and Dawson and all of those and Hairston. That's why you would see, um, some of the writings. And Stacy will still do that. Sometimes I'll do that, using DE, instead of THE. But really, to me, it is the most important thing to ensure that that melody remains intact. I mean, my harmonies go all over the place, but my melodies, as best as they can, and they're not my melodies. The melodies of our ancestors are to remain intact because that is the soul connection to the original, to the raw. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. What do you hope that audiences and performers take away from the work that has been done with spirituals, especially the work that you've done with the spiritual?
My motion these days, it started out in the pandemic specifically, is to make people aware that there are humans connected to this music. We are 400 something years removed, if you could say, from, the uh, beginnings of the enslavement of Africans in these United States. There is the collective community of composers of the Negro spiritual, but I imagine it all started out with one mother who, in the matter of minutes, was stripped away from her entire family by virtue of an auction or worse. Um, and the only thing that was left to her was to start singing something, such that we are in whatever space we are, locale, experiencing these spirituals, that we cannot forget that there is a human within that score that is connected to what it is that we're experiencing, whether it be a Brazil Dinar, very traditional arrangement, or something as out there as they led my Lord away, and that's very interesting too because our ancestors connected to the travails of biblical characters like Jesus and all of those that were connected to Jesus during the time of his imprisonment and later crucifixion. The story of they led my Lord away, please tell me where to find him. You know, very, very well could have been either of the Marys, which means it could have also, connected to that mother having lost two of her babies, to the auction block. There are real humans connected to the storyline. And that idea of loss is not based in the past. We still deal with loss now. And so I have spiritual arrangements that I wrote out of my own, emotional pains and woes. So I connect that present emotion to those of the ancestors. That's what's really important to me, remembering that there are humans connected to these octavos, to these scores, to this hearing. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That sort of along that same route, we've talked about sort of audience expectations and performer expectations. What advice would you give young composers and conductors and performers of spirituals who wish to engage with this art form in a deeply reverent and respectful way?
Read, 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 read. One of the first books that any arranger, composer, conductor should have is the Music of Black Americans by Dr. Eileen Southern. It is crucial. Other books would include, the tome by my dear mentor, Dr. Andre Thomas, way over in Beulah land, that really specifically goes into, the evolution of the Negro spiritual, but also about the arrangement and how it is that people should approach these arrangements. They should look at the various collections of Negro spirituals. You could go all the way back to the 1867 collection by Garrison and those, but also, John Works collections, Debt's collections. One of the collections that I use a lot to really try and find, how shall we say, the not those outside of like the top 10 and top 20 spirituals that seem to be recycled in arrangement continuum. The collection by the Johnson brothers, you know, James Weldon and Jay Roseman. It's a great two-book collection of spirituals. So these collections hold within them not just a number of different melodies of spirituals, but they also hold within them some storyline and some instruction. So that's really my biggest thing is to read. The other thing that I would notion to them to read, not outside of the musical history, books like Stamped from the Beginning, A Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, or Caste, or the Discontent book by Isabel Wilkerson, but also her other book about the Great Migration, Warmth from Other Suns, hugely important literary repertoire, because it's important if we're going to give proper reverence, then you really need to know the storyline of it all. That's my biggest thing. Read, 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 and study, and then go and read through and peruse the scores of some of the greats. Our first, like Burley and Dawson and Price and Moore, and Whalum. All of those that came before us. Because before you start to get into all of the new harmonies and stuff, you really need to see them at their most basic and beautiful. Yeah.
And sort of along that same line, then, how do you hope that future composers and arrangers will build upon your contributions to the spiritual and Black sacred music?
Oh, mm. To not be fearful. I mean, this is a music to be proud of, and I know that there is a way to balance the respect for the initial and still bring yourself to not be fearful to bring yourself into the continuum. The ancestors beg of us to bring ourselves into the continuum, and it can be done respectfully. Um, my life, not only creatively, but just in general, is about seeking balance. Um, and Black music has always been about the balance of understanding the reality of a situation, but also having a present hope for a brighter future. That is the beautiful balance of Black music. And the Negro spiritual, the first of these, is so wonderful in bringing to us, you know, nobody knows the trouble I've seen, you know, nobody knows but Jesus. Nobody knows the trouble I've seen. And then it says, glory, hallelujah. I always find that to be so powerful and so poignant that one would sit in the understanding of the woe, but then say, but glory, hallelujah, it will be better than this. Even if it turns out not better for me, it's going to be better for those who come after me, you know. So that is my hope that those who find it of weight to utilize any of my work as a foundation for their own would not be afraid to seek that balance. It takes work. It also takes a general understanding of yourself, and then to know that you will evolve. All of any great writer, their music evolves over time because they evolve as people. So once again, this idea of humans being connected to the score. We are just as connected to the scores as we write as are the original composers, this community, this invisible church. So we have to find that balance together. Yeah.
Yeah, that's all really great. So, part of my recital, my lecture recital that I'm doing, obviously, I'm going to get up and talk for a while, but then we get to my favorite part as a choral conducting student, and that's the actual performance. And so, the format that this is taking in my recital is for each of the composers that I'm looking to represent, I'll be programming one piece from each of them. And to represent you, I've chosen a piece that I actually got to perform with the EMU choir in my undergrad several years ago, which is your arrangement of Wait Till I Get on My Robe. So I'd like to talk a little bit about that. So what just
Okay.
off the bat, initially, what words would you use to describe the nature of this piece?
Oh, that is balance all over. Yeah, that is balance all over. So the story behind this was a commissioned piece by a foreign choir for a birthday commemoration for a dear friend and mentor of mine by the name of Gary Graydon. He's just an amazing man, actually American, but has been um, overseas working with amazing choirs. This particular choir, St. Jacob's Chamber Choir, which he actually just was retired from. But they reached out to me to write this as a birthday piece for him. And so this choir, if you've never heard them, I'm just an amazing sound. And I mean, you could put anything on a piece of paper and they will read it, you know, as if they've been, seeing it for all of their lives. So I was able to get a lot done and a lot accomplished, but there is still this hearkening to the traditional element of that. There are some of the early arrangers, composers that would use what is called a hidden refrain. Eileen Southern would refer to it as a hidden refrain, so like a spiritual within a spiritual. And so the main spiritual is, wait till I put on my robe. But then inside of there's a do don't touch my garment, good Lord, good Lord. And that is certainly that is my Whalum, that's my Brazil Denard, all of the traditional elements of the spiritual, as you would recognize, between, 30s and 50s, approach to spiritual arranging is in there. The rest of it is inclusive of jazz. Um, it is inclusive of gospel moment, when you get to the ostinato, as plainly as I can put it, it is a gospel vamp. And so my first word is balance, of finding all of the things of me that I love and still making room for those traditional elements of the thing. Yeah.
So, can you discuss? I think the most fascinating part of this arrangement is your harmonic choices. I'm hoping that maybe you can discuss some of these harmonic choices you made and where these choices stem from. You've mentioned gospel, you've mentioned jazz. I'm wondering if you can speak on that.
Absolutely. I believe that text should be very influential upon your harmonic choices. So even at the very beginning, you have this octave displaced weight, and then these two, you know, crazy chords. But the first words are wait, And so there is pause, there's this anticipation about, well, what is it that we're waiting for? And then the wait is, of course, in the text, it's wait till I get on my robe, wait till and the robe has certainly been unearthed to us in Christian ideology as, I'm gonna get my crown, wait till I get my robe and my crown. All of that means I'm headed up, I'm headed up heaven bound. But in terms of harmony, we're waiting for release. We are waiting for these chords to resolve. Um, and so a lot of that is this tension release, because we are so anxious for the thing, and the anxiousness lends itself to crunch chord texture. And so there's always this bit of tension in the harmony that wants to resolve itself at some point. So I think that's really where it stems from. The text really makes for the harmonies. I am a huge fan of so many of the great harmony benders, vocally speaking. Take Six is really huge to me. Oh my goodness, when I first heard that first CD by them, I lost my mind. And of course, they come out of the great Aeolian, tradition. My dear friends like Jason Max Ferdinand and all of those who created such beautiful, beautiful, beautiful harmonies, and made it possible for tensions to not only be experienced via instrumentation, but by virtue of voice. But also in the city of Detroit, you had writers like Twinkie Clark and Thomas Whitfield, who were not afraid to create beautifully tense-related harmonies. Twinkie writing for her sisters, the Clark sisters, Tommy writing for the Thomas Whitfield Company, back in the 70s and 80s, when harmonies like that they just weren't something that vocal groups were doing specifically in Black gospel music. Um, yeah, absolutely. That's where a lot of that stems from.
And how do the musical elements of this arrangement reflect your broader compositional approach?
Oh, great question. Glad you asked it. I don't find this arrangement to be too far at all from my general scope of composition. I am a pianist by by trade. That's really where I started out, and so much of my writing starts here. One of the things that I became more mindful of is getting my ear, because I sing as well. All of my degrees are voice based. So making sure that whatever I played at the piano, that I have a vocal ear for how that translates into an ensemble setting. One of the things that really assisted me in that effort is being a collaborative pianist. And so, whether I was in high school playing for rehearsals or when I got to Morehouse, I was one of the collaborative pianists for the Morehouse College Glee Club. And as I was listening to the Glee Club sing, I was looking at the score. And so I'm saying, oh, I like how this sounds out there. This on the score is what is allowing for that sound from a harmonic standpoint. And so I would take time at the piano to unearth what more of these transitions, what more of these harmonies, what more of these musical phrasings will really work, and will really speak in a different way. Um, I am probably well, yes, I am definitely of the three of those that I spoke of, me, Stacy, and Damon. I'm definitely more of the pianist led of the troupe, and so um, my harmonies are certainly more instrumentally founded. But because of my background as a singer, I try to find the balance of ensuring that it still works. Um, but it can be jarring. It can be jarring. I can't tell you how many times I will get an email from someone saying, "Are you sure is this a typo?" And I said, "No, no, no, that's it. We want the rub, but we don't ask about the rub when it's at the piano. We said when we see it on the score for choirs, we often think that it's a mistake, and often, I mean, almost all the time, when someone reaches out to me and asks if it's a mistake, it's not. It is extremely intentional tension. That's the phrase, extremely intentional tension.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So, in relation to Wait Till I Get On My Robe, what musical choices made by the conductor and the choir separates a great performance of the piece from an exceptional performance?
Attention to text, attention to intentionality of rhythm. You know, for most of the spiritual continuum, um, the songs were working music. And for that reason, from a rhythmic standpoint, from a metric standpoint, a lot of those spirituals need to be felt on the one and three rather than a gospel two and four. That's one big thing. And Gary, love him to death, but when he got with the choir, the first interpretation of it that you'll hear is he swings it, you know. Fine, they sound great. But it should be, wait Lord, till I get on my, because that is in essence translating itself to the work that's being done, you know, in the field. And the metric weight beautifully and poetically connects itself to the weight of the text. So those are two things that will um, sort of define whether this is, a good sounding performance and an informed performance. I'll go once again and say, read, 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 and you'll gather all that you need in terms of information. Yeah.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I know I've heard that premiere performance by the chamber choir that you
Mhm.
mentioned, and I'm pretty sure that when we did it many years ago, sure we swung it too, probably based off of that recording.
Yeah.
Uh, so I think I don't have the score in front of me, but I believe what you said was something about a strong lilt. Then,
Yes. Oh my
yes.
goodness. Oh my, ooh, that is straight from the mouth of Dr. Wendell Phillips Wade. And the lilt is the internal heartbeat of the spiritual.
Okay, that's very good to know for when I
Yeah.
start rehearsal here in about a month. Um,
Yes, sir.
yes. So, would you describe this arrangement as an expansion of the spiritual tradition or as a continuation spoken in your modern voice?
Oh, I think it's a continuation. I think that there are other arrangements of mine that are a bit more of an expansion. I'll go back to, something like They Led My Lord Away, which is um yeah, it's probably one of my more out there settings of spirituals that I've done. Something like They Led My Lord Away is definitely more of an expansion um of where spirituals could lead, spiritual arrangements can lead. Um, Wait Till I Get on My Robe really sits more in the continuum because to me it still holds some of the um, kind of base foundational techniques of the format of a spiritual arrangement. I know the harmonies are out there, but we're not exceptionally new to to that experience. I mean, Moses Hogan would throw a thing at you sometimes. Even when you go back to I think about mentors of mine like Robert Morris. And if you think some of my stuff is out there, I mean Robert has some crazy trippy harmonies, in his spiritual arrangements, and he was doing that stuff 10, 15 years before me, if not longer. Certainly if we look at some of the arrangements of those that come out of the Seventh Day Adventist tradition, those harmonies are clear. And their take six, was writing crazy stuff. So it's definitely more in the continuum of the tradition. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just have one closing question overall for us, going back to sort of the topic of my recital being the Michigan composer's influence on the development of the spiritual. Uh, my final question for you today is why do spirituals still matter today, specifically here and now in Michigan?
There is, to me, no more important city in the development of American music than Detroit, Michigan. They'll fight me all day on it. It's okay. I'll take the blunt. So that being said, if Detroit is indeed the most American city, the most important city in the development of American music, and when I say American music, I say Black music, because that's really what it is. The foundation of that is the spiritual. The foundation of Black American music is the spiritual. The foundation of American music is the spiritual. And so it would behoove us to say that it must remain an indelibly important form of expression for us in Michigan, in the city of Detroit, um, just for that simple equation, you know, for us to, as a city, as a state, to continue to hold this banner high of American music form, we cannot dispense with the birth mother, with the birth mother of all of this. Yeah. As far as we go with expanding harmony and rhythm and form, we can never forget that which made it possible, you know, for us to do that, for us to be able to expand. So, yeah, that's my thought.
Yeah, well, all of this was very informative. Thank you for joining me today, Dr. Waddles. Do you have anything that you'd like to contribute here now that we're sort of closing up?
I just want to say thank you. Thank you for reaching out. Thank you for finding importance in this topic. And if you need anything, you got my number. So just hit me up. Let me know.